she had always loved her home. It was a modest house tucked into a quiet neighborhood, where winters painted the streets in soft white and the smell of pine sometimes drifted through the air. For years, she had lived there peacefully, enjoying the small joys of life, the warm glow of her living room in the evenings, the occasional snowball fights she watched from her window, and the sound of children laughing on the sidewalk. She had worked hard to make her house a place of comfort and pride, tending her garden, keeping her lawn neat, and decorating for the holidays in ways that brought her joy and sometimes smiles from the neighbors at first. The Homeowners Association had seemed like a helpful presence. They spoke about community rules in a friendly way and offered advice on keeping the neighborhood looking nice. She had followed most of their rules, sometimes even more than was necessary just to avoid trouble. But over time, things changed. The HOA, which had once seemed reasonable, began to show a more controlling side. They were quick to find fault, even with the smallest things. If someone left a trash can out for too long, they would send a notice. If a lawn had a weed or a flower in the wrong place, a letter would arrive in the mail. What had once seemed helpful now felt intrusive and sometimes insulting. She tried to ignore it at first, thinking it was just a few overly strict members who didn't understand that life wasn't perfect. She figured she could handle it quietly, but then it escalated. A notice arrived one crisp winter morning, neatly folded and stamped with the HOA's emblem. The letter complained about a simple decoration she had placed near her front door. Small snowman she had made with her own hands, meant to welcome the season and bring some cheer. According to them, it was unsuitable for community standards and must be removed immediately. She stared at the paper, incredulous. This was what had triggered them. A tiny snowman on her porch? Her heart sank, not just because of the letter itself, but because it came with an added threat. If she didn't comply, there would be fines, escalating fees, and a warning that her neighbors would be informed. She felt a mix of anger and embarrassment. How could anyone feel humiliated over something so small? How could they wield this kind of power over people's lives in a place that was supposed to feel safe and welcoming? She considered removing the snowman just to avoid conflict, but the thought made her uneasy. Every time she looked at the letter, she felt the sting of injustice. It was more than just about the snowman. It was about the principle. She had obeyed most of the rules all along, sometimes more than necessary. And now it felt like the HOA was looking for any opportunity to assert their authority and make her feel small. They were trying to humiliate her, and she wasn't going to let them do it quietly. The days that followed were tense. She found herself watching the neighborhood more closely, noticing the HOA members walking the streets, inspecting properties with their clipboards and stern expressions. They seemed to take pleasure in enforcing minor rules, and she realized that this wasn't a one-time thing. This was their pattern, and she had become a target. She felt isolated at first, unsure if anyone else saw what she was experiencing. Some neighbors seemed oblivious, busy with their own lives, while others nodded politely when she spoke about the situation but didn't offer help. She was on her own. At the same time, she refused to let fear take over her life. She had always been resourceful, and now she needed to channel her energy into thinking clearly. She spent her evenings reading the HOA's rules and regulations, studying each word and clause. She discovered that many of the rules were vague and open to interpretation, giving the HOA room to claim violations almost at will. She also found small loopholes that could be used in her favor if she needed them. This gave her a glimmer of hope. She wasn't powerless, and she could find a way to respond. She would need patience and careful planning. Life went on, but every day she felt the weight of the letters and warnings. The snowman was eventually removed, but the sting of humiliation lingered. She noticed that the HOA seemed to patrol the neighborhood more often, and the tension in her interactions with them grew. She could feel their eyes on her whenever she stepped outside, their judgmental glances like invisible chains trying to control her behavior. She refused to let it break her spirit. Instead, she began keeping a small notebook, jotting down everything that happened: dates, times, conversations, letters. It became her record of events, a shield against the creeping fear of unjust authority. Her frustration turned into quiet determination. She knew that whatever she did next would have to be clever and thoughtful. Reacting impulsively could backfire, making the situation worse. But doing nothing was no longer an option. She wanted to assert her dignity without causing real harm, to find a way to show that she could stand her ground while still respecting the law. The winter had been harsh that year, with heavy snowfall piling up on the streets. At first, she had seen it as a nuisance, trudging through snowdrifts just to get to her mailbox or shovel her driveway. But as she observed the streets and the behavior of the HOA, an idea began to form in her mind. Snow was everywhere, covering the neighborhood in a quiet, soft blanket, and it could be used in a way that would make a point without breaking any rules. She didn't share her thoughts with anyone yet, not even her closest friends. She needed to think it through, to plan carefully, and to consider the consequences. Every day she watched the snowfall, noticing how it accumulated in corners, along sidewalks, and around the street edges. She thought about the HOA members' routines when they left their houses and how they moved through the neighborhood. She imagined the impact of a well-timed, well-placed obstacles, something that would be noticed immediately and clearly, but without causing danger or damage. The idea was beginning to take shape, growing stronger with each day of careful observation. Despite the cold, she began to prepare. She collected shovels and tools, making sure she had everything she might need. She also continued documenting the HOA's actions, keeping her notebook current and detailed. The combination of planning and recording gave her a sense of control and calm in the midst of the escalating tension. She knew that the path ahead required patience, courage, and clever thinking. She wasn't just reacting out of anger. She was planning a response that would send a clear message about standing up to unfair authority. During this time, she also reflected on her own values and what her home meant to her. This wasn't just about proving a point to the HOA. It was about protecting her sense of self and her right to live peacefully. She wanted to enjoy her neighborhood, to watch the snowfall, to feel pride in her home without fear of constant scrutiny or arbitrary humiliation. She reminded herself that her actions had to be guided by thoughtfulness and responsibility. Any misstep could turn a simple act of defiance into a situation that caused real problems for her and for others. The tension in the neighborhood was palpable. Some neighbors whispered about the HOA's strictness, while others acted as if nothing was happening. She realized that many people felt the same frustration privately, but lacked the courage to speak up. She drew strength from knowing that she was not truly alone, even if it seemed that way. Her quiet determination grew, fueled by the injustice she had endured and the desire to reclaim her dignity as the snow continued to fall. Covering the neighborhood in a pristine layer, she began to feel a sense of anticipation. The world around her seemed still and quiet, as if waiting for her to take action. She knew that when the time came, she would have to act decisively and carefully. She would use the environment, her wits, and her courage to make a statement that would be noticed and remembered. She imagined the moment when the HOA would encounter her plan and feel the impact of her cleverness. It was not just about winning. It was about standing tall in the face of unfairness. About showing that dignity and intelligence could overcome arbitrary power. She spent long evenings by the window, watching the snow drift silently across the streets, thinking about how ordinary things could become extraordinary with the right perspective. She realized that the winter, which had at first seemed inconvenient, had given her an opportunity. It offered a natural tool and a quiet canvas for her to assert herself without harming anyone. She felt a strange mix of excitement and calm, knowing that she had found a way to respond thoughtfully and creatively in the quiet of her home. Surrounded by the soft glow of lights and the comforting presence of her familiar surroundings, she made a silent promise to herself. She would not allow the HOA to humiliate her or anyone else unjustly. She would use her intelligence, her patience, and the unique circumstances of winter to reclaim her sense of control. This promise gave her strength and focus. She knew that the challenge ahead required more than just courage. It required strategy, planning, and a careful balance between boldness and safety. As the first part of her journey came to an end, she felt a mixture of anticipation and resolve. The tension in the neighborhood, the strict rules of the HOA, and the weight of their judgments were all part of the story that was unfolding. She was ready to take the next steps, knowing that the winter, the snow, her own cleverness would become allies in her quest to stand up for herself. This was only the beginning, and the path ahead was both exciting and uncertain. But for the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of empowerment. She knew that she could face the HOA's attempts at humiliation with intelligence, courage, and creativity, turning the situation into an opportunity to assert her dignity and make a lasting impression. The morning started quietly, with the soft light off winter creeping through the blinds. She stepped outside wrapped in a warm coat and scarf, carrying a cup of steaming coffee, and felt the chill in the air. Snow had fallen heavily overnight, covering the streets, the sidewalks, and the tops of parked cars in a thick, pristine layer. Everything looked peaceful, almost magical, but she knew that beneath the quiet beauty, tension was rising. The HOA had escalated their efforts to assert control, and today she felt the weight of their attention more than ever. The first sign of trouble came when a neighbor walking their dog stopped near her gate. They whispered hurriedly, glancing around nervously, and told her that the HOA members were walking the street, inspecting every property. They'd been through the neighborhood early that morning, checking driveways, mailboxes, and even the smallest decorations. She felt her stomach tighten. She had removed the snowman as instructed, but it seemed that the HOA wasn't satisfied with just one victory. Their aim had become clearer. They wanted to humiliate her, make her feel powerless, and show everyone that they were in control. She decided to watch them from her window. Through the frost on the glass, she could see them moving in small groups, clipboards in hand, nodding to each other as they inspected the properties. Their faces were serious, almost aggressive in their focus. They weren't just enforcing rules, they were hunting for violations, looking for any excuse to issue warnings, fines, or public embarrassment. Her heart sank as she realized how methodical they were and how personal their mission against her had become. Despite the fear she felt, she refused to let it control her actions. She took a deep breath and reminded herself that she had been here before. She had faced challenges, and she had survived by staying calm, observant, and resourceful. Today would be no different. She poured another cup of coffee and moved closer to the window, watching as they approached her street. Their footsteps crunched on the snow, and their eyes scanned every inch of the yards, every mailbox, every driveway edge. She felt the tension tighten in her chest, but she also felt a spark of determination. She would not be humiliated in front of her neighbors, not by people who were abusing their power. She remembered the notebook she had started weeks ago, documenting every interaction, every letter, and every warning. She grabbed it and flipped through the pages, reviewing the evidence she had collected. Each entry reminded her that she had been patient, careful, and fair. She had followed most of the rules to the letter, yet the HOA persisted in their relentless pursuit of control. Their letters and inspections had become more frequent, more pointed, and more invasive. This wasn't just about community standards anymore. It was about asserting dominance, and she knew she had to respond. That morning, the HOA members stopped in front of her house. She could see them from her window, whispering to one another, pointing at small features of her property. Her stomach tightened with anxiety and anger. They were looking for anything to use against her. She noticed one of them pull out a camera from their coat pocket, clearly taking pictures of her property. She clenched her fists. This was exactly what she had feared, an attempt to document her for public embarrassment. But she also noticed something else. The snow around her driveway and sidewalk was undisturbed, clean, and thick. It could be used in ways they didn't expect. A plan started forming in her mind, and with it came a sense of quiet excitement. She knew she needed to be clever. Direct confrontation could backfire, but indirect action, using the snow as her ally, might give her an advantage. She observed the HOA members closely, taking note of their movements, the order in which they checked the houses, and how long they lingered in front of certain properties. They moved with confidence, but they were predictable in their routines. Every day, they walked the same paths, inspected the same corners, and returned to their vehicles at almost the same time. If she timed her actions correctly, she could create a situation that would surprise them, one that would assert her presence without breaking any laws. For hours, she remained in her home, moving quietly, occasionally peeking through the blinds. She watched as they left her street and moved to the next, their clipboards full of notes and photos. She felt a strange mix of relief and anticipation. The tension had built to a point where she needed action, but the snow outside offered both a tool and a canvas. She thought about how to use it creatively, safely, and cleverly. Wanted her response to be clear and undeniable, something that would make the HOA realize that she would not be pushed around without consequence. Her mind worked like a machine, turning over possibilities. She considered every angle, every risk, and every potential outcome. She knew that her actions had to be bold enough to be noticed, but careful enough to avoid danger or legal issues. Snow was a natural, temporary barrier, and it could be shaped, moved, or piled strategically without causing harm. She imagined the HOA arriving one morning, ready to continue their inspections, only to encounter her clever arrangement. The thought made her smile. She felt a rush of empowerment, a sense that she could reclaim control over her own space and dignity. But before taking any action, she needed to observe more. She spent the afternoon watching from her window, noting how the snow drifted across the street, how it collected near the curb, and how vehicles navigated the neighborhood. She made sketches in her notebook, marking the spots where snow could be piled to create maximum visibility and impact. She imagined the HOA members walking down the street, their eyes scanning for violations, only to be stopped in their tracks by the obstacles she had created. It wasn't about revenge. It was about sending a clear message that she would not be intimidated. Neighbors began to notice the increased activity as well. Some paused to chat with her over the fence, mentioning the HOA's strict inspections and expressing quiet sympathy. Others watched from a distance, curious but hesitant to get involved. She felt a small sense of solidarity, knowing that she wasn't completely alone in her struggle. The quiet support of her neighbors, even if indirect, added to her determination to act thoughtfully and strategically. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the snow-covered street, she felt a mix of fatigue and anticipation. She had spent the day observing, recording, and planning. She knew that the next step required precision and courage. Went inside, warmed herself by the fireplace, and reviewed her notes once more. Every detail mattered. The timing of the HOA's rounds, the placement of the snow, the safety of the street, and the impact on visibility. She needed to make sure that her plan was both effective and responsible. That night, she barely slept. Her mind kept turning over scenarios, imagining the reactions of the HOA, the neighbors, and even herself. She visualized the moment of encounter, the surprise, the frustration, and the undeniable statement her actions would make. It wasn't about anger alone. It was about reclaiming respect and asserting her dignity in a situation where she had been unfairly targeted. She felt a mix of excitement and calm, knowing that she had considered every angle and that the snow, her patience, and her careful planning would become her allies. Morning came again, crisp and clear. She stepped outside, feeling the cold bite of winter on her cheeks, and looked at the snow-covered street with renewed determination. The HOA's presence loomed in her mind, but she felt ready. She had observed, recorded, and planned. The tension that had been building for weeks was about to reach its peak. She moved quietly, thinking about the steps she would take, the timing of each action, and the impact it would have. Every decision had to be deliberate, every movement calculated. She felt a surge of empowerment. The HOA had tried to humiliate her to assert control over her life, but she had refused to be passive. She had used her intelligence, her patience, and the resources available to hurt the snow, the quiet streets, the observation of routines to prepare a response that was clever, safe, and undeniable. She knew that the situation could still change, that risks remained, but she was ready to act when the moment came. The neighborhood remained quiet, the snow glistening in the morning light. She could hear distant footsteps and occasional voices, but her focus was on the task ahead. She had learned that dealing with the HOA required more than anger. It required strategy, careful observation, and the willingness to act boldly when the opportunity presented itself. She felt a deep sense of readiness, knowing that her actions would speak louder than words, that her clever planning would assert her dignity without causing harm, and that she could face the challenge with intelligence and courage. Hours passed as she continued to prepare, ensuring that every detail was perfect. She moved snow quietly, testing the way it could be shaped and placed. She imagined the path of the HOA members, the route they would take, and how her arrangement could create the desired impact. She thought about the neighbors, the reactions, and the statement she was making. This was not just about one encounter. It was about asserting her presence, her intelligence, and her refusal to be humiliated. It was about taking control of a situation that had been oppressive and turning it into an opportunity to demonstrate its resilience and cleverness. As the day drew to a close, she felt a mixture of exhaustion and anticipation. The tension that had been building for weeks, the constant letters, warnings, and inspections had all led to this moment. She knew that the next day could bring confrontation, surprise, and the satisfaction of standing her ground. She had prepared, observed, and planned carefully. The snow outside was not just frozen water. It had become a tool, a statement, and a symbol of her determination. She went inside, warmed herself, and looked out the window at the quiet neighborhood, knowing that when the moment came, she would be ready to act with intelligence, courage, and dignity. The next morning, the sun rose over the snow-covered neighborhood, casting a soft glow across the white landscape. She stepped outside again, feeling the cold bite of winter on her cheeks. But today, there was a different sense in the air. Today, she wasn't just observing. Today, her mind was fully occupied with a plan that had been forming in the back of her thoughts for days. It was not a rash decision. It was the result of careful observation, patient documentation, deliberate consideration of every possible angle. She began by reviewing her notes from the previous days. Every interaction with the HOA, every letter, every inspection, and every observation of their routines had been recorded. She had noticed patterns: how they walked down the streets, the timing of their visits, the order in which they checked each property. The HOA members were meticulous, predictable, and somewhat overconfident in their authority. These patterns were her advantage. By knowing their routines, she could plan a response that was strategic, clever, effective, without causing harm or breaking any rules. Her first step was to study the streets and the snow itself. The winter had left deep layers of snow on the sidewalks, the curbs, and the edges of the roads. She walked carefully through her property and the neighboring streets, observing how the snow had drifted and where it could be moved or shaped. She made sketches in her notebook, marking potential spots where snow could be piled or arranged, to create an obstacle that would be immediately noticeable but not dangerous. Each sketch was accompanied by notes about timing, visibility, and safety, ensuring that nothing was left to chance. As she walked, she imagined the reactions of the HOA members. She pictured them approaching her street with their clipboards, expecting to continue their routine inspections, only to encounter her carefully arranged snow barrier. She thought about the surprise, the confusion, and the undeniable statement it would make. This was not about anger or revenge. It was about asserting her dignity and showing that she would not be intimidated. The image of their frustration fueled her determination and made her feel empowered. Back inside, she gathered the tools she would need. Shovels, a snow rake, gloves, and a few other items were collected and organized. She wanted to make sure she could work efficiently and safely without wasting energy or creating unnecessary risk. She also considered the timing of her actions. The HOA typically visited in the late morning, so she planned to make her move early, ensuring that the snow would be fresh and strategically placed before they arrived. Every detail mattered. She was committed to executing the plan with precision. Her thoughts then turned to safety and responsibility. She knew that the goal was to create a statement, not to endanger anyone. The snow had to be arranged in a way that was clearly visible, non-slippery, and easy to navigate around if necessary. She considered the neighbors who might be walking their dogs, children who might play outside, and delivery vehicles that occasionally came down the street. By planning carefully, she could make her message clear while still respecting the well-being of everyone around her. As she prepared, she also reflected on the emotions that had brought her to this point. Frustration, anger, and a sense of injustice had been her initial motivators. But over time, they had transformed into strategic thinking, creativity, and quiet determination. She realized that she had grown through this process. She was learning patience, planning, and the power of using intelligence rather than force to achieve a goal. This reflection gave her confidence that she could handle whatever the HOA might throw her way late in the morning. She stepped outside to begin shaping the snow. She moved carefully, using the shovels and snow rake to create low, even piles across specific points on the street near her property. Each pile was positioned for maximum visibility, designed to slow movement and draw attention without blocking the road entirely or creating hazards. She worked steadily, her breath visible in the cold air, her movements deliberate and precise. Every step was guided by the sketches and notes she had prepared over the past days as she worked. She imagined the HOA members' reactions again. She pictured their expressions as they encountered the snow, the way they would pause, inspect, and try to figure out what had happened. She smiled at the thought of them, realizing that she had anticipated their every move and had responded with intelligence and creativity. This was not about winning or losing. It was about standing up, asserting her presence, and reclaiming the dignity they had tried to take from her. Neighbors began to notice her efforts. Some waved from a distance, curious about what she was doing. She nodded politely, keeping her focus on the task at hand. She knew that their attention could be a benefit, creating witnesses to the HOA's eventual reactions. But she remained careful not to engage in any discussions that might distract her or reveal her full plan prematurely. This was a moment that required focus, patience, and discretion. Hours passed as she continued to shape and arrange the snow. She stepped back occasionally to assess the progress, making small adjustments to ensure symmetry, visibility, and safety. The piles began to take on a deliberate pattern, guiding the eye and slowing movement in a way that would be immediately noticeable. Each adjustment was thoughtful, calculated, and strategic. She felt a growing sense of satisfaction as the plan came together. The tension that had been building for weeks was beginning to transform into a tangible, actionable form. As the day progressed, she also prepared mentally for the confrontation that might follow. She knew that the HOA could react with frustration, anger, or confusion. She rehearsed calmly in her mind how she would respond if questioned, making sure to emphasize safety, legality, and the fact that she was not causing harm. By preparing mentally, she could remain calm, assertive, and composed, no matter what happened. This mental preparation was as important as the physical arrangement of the snow. Late afternoon brought a quiet pause in the neighborhood. The streets were empty, the snow glistening in the fading light. She took a moment to rest, leaning against the shovel and looking at the scene she had created. The snow piles were arranged exactly as she had planned, strategically placed to draw attention and make a statement. She felt a sense of accomplishment, knowing that she had used her intelligence, patience, and observation skills to transform frustration into a thoughtful, creative response. The anticipation was almost tangible. She imagined the HOA members returning, their usual confidence meeting the unexpected reality of her actions. She imagined the pause, the inspection, the confusion, and finally, the realization that they had underestimated her. She smiled quietly, feeling a sense of empowerment that came not from confrontation or force, but from careful planning, observation, and clever use of her environment. Evening fell, and she returned inside to warm up and review her plan one last time. She made small notes about timing, safety, and potential adjustments if needed. She also reflected on the personal growth she had experienced during this process. She had learned patience, strategy, and the power of thinking creatively under pressure. She had transformed frustration and anger into a carefully executed plan that maintained dignity, safety, and legality. That night, as she lay in bed, she imagined the coming day with excitement and calm. The snow outside, which had seemed like an inconvenience, had become an ally and a tool. Her careful observation and documentation had provided the foundation for a strategic, clever, and responsible action. She felt ready, confident, and prepared. The HOA had tried to humiliate her, to assert control over her life. But she had transformed the situation into an opportunity to assert her intelligence, creativity, and dignity. She fell asleep with a sense of purpose and anticipation. Tomorrow, the snow would speak for her. Tomorrow, her careful planning and strategic thinking would be on full display. She had prepared, observed, and executed the first steps of her plan. The journey was far from over, but she felt empowered, capable, and ready to face whatever challenges the HOA might bring. This was not just about snow or streets. It was about standing up, asserting herself, and showing that intelligence, patience, and careful planning could overcome unfairness and intimidation. The morning arrived crisp and clear, the sun reflecting off the fresh snow in dazzling patterns. She stepped outside, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. Everything looked calm and quiet, but she knew that beneath the beauty, the moment of truth had come. The snow piles she had arranged the day before were still perfectly in place, their positions deliberate and safe, yet impossible to ignore. Each mound of snow seemed to shine with the promise of the confrontation that was about to unfold. She watched from her window, quietly observing the neighborhood. The streets were empty at first, the calm of winter morning stretching across the quiet rows of houses. Then, in the distance, she saw them, the HOA members, walking with purpose, clipboards in hand, as if expecting a routine morning of inspections. She felt a surge of anticipation and focus. Everything she had planned, every observation and calculation, was about to be tested as the HOA approached her street. She could see the confidence in their posture, the authority they felt over the neighborhood. But as they drew closer to her property, the first signs of hesitation appeared. Their eyes widened slightly at the sight before them. The carefully arranged snow piles caught their attention immediately. They slowed their steps, their expressions shifting from routine determination to surprise and confusion. She felt a quiet satisfaction. Knowing that her strategy had worked as intended, she continued to observe, taking note of their reactions. One member stepped forward cautiously, tapping the snow with the end of a shovel to test its stability. Another circled around, trying to find a way past the mounds without touching them. She watched the small gestures, the whispered conversations, and the puzzled glances exchanged between them. The snow had created an unexpected obstacle, and it was clear that they had not anticipated it. Her heart swelled with a mix of pride and calm confidence. The neighbors, noticing the activity, began to come outside as well. Some peeked from their windows. Others stepped onto their porches, curious about what was happening. She had not expected this, but the presence of witnesses added to the moment. The HOA members were now aware that they were being observed, not just by her, but by the people they claimed to serve. Their authority, which had seemed absolute, was now visibly challenged. The HOA members tried to maneuver around the snow. They took notes, discussed possibilities, and even considered moving the snow themselves. She watched every action, analyzing their thinking and responding mentally with the adjustments she had prepared in case of such maneuvers. She had ensured that the piles were safe, stable, and strategically placed so that any attempt to remove or bypass them would be slow and deliberate. The HOA had expected a routine inspection. Instead, they encountered her intelligence, planning, and careful preparation. She noticed a shift in their behavior. Frustration began to creep into their expressions. Their confidence was eroding under the unexpected challenge. They whispered to each other, their usual decisiveness replaced by hesitation and careful calculation. She could almost hear the internal struggle, the recognition that this homeowner had thought ahead and created a situation that could not be icily dismissed. Her satisfaction grew, not out of malice, but from the understanding that her careful planning had neutralized the humiliation they had intended. At this moment, she decided to step outside fully, maintaining a calm and composed demeanor. She walked to a position where she could be seen clearly, yet at a safe distance from the snow piles. She wanted to show that she was not intimidated, that she had acted responsibly and thoughtfully, and that she would engage if necessary, but not aggressively. Her presence added a human element to the scene, reminding everyone that these were not just rules on paper, but people affected by the decisions being made. The HOA members noticed her and paused, their conversation halting as they looked at her. She could see a mixture of surprise and uncertainty in their expressions. She spoke calmly, explaining that the snow piles were arranged intentionally for visibility and safety, and that she had ensured they did not block the road completely or create hazards. Her tone was measured, firm, and assertive. She did not apologize or explain unnecessarily. She stated facts clearly, leaving no room for misinterpretation. This simple act of composure added weight to her presence. The members attempted to respond, questioning her intentions and the placement of the snow. She answered each question calmly, pointing out the care she had taken and emphasizing that her actions were responsible and safe. Her clear communication, combined with the undeniable presence of the snow, created a situation in which the HOA could not assert authority without looking unreasonable. She had transformed their attempt to humiliate her into a demonstration of intelligence, foresight, and careful planning. As the morning progressed, more neighbors came outside, curious and engaged. They watched quietly, some whispering to each other about the unexpected turn of events. She remained composed, understanding that her actions were now observed not just by the HOA, but by the wider community. This added an additional layer of accountability to the HOA members' behavior. They could no longer act solely on authority. They had to consider public perception. Her plan had succeeded in creating a situation that was visible, undeniable, and respectful of safety and legality. The HOA members continued to inspect the snow piles, taking notes and discussing among themselves. She observed the gradual shift from frustration to reluctant respect. Their expressions softened slightly, realizing that her actions were not reckless, but deliberate and intelligent. She had taken what could have been a moment of humiliation and transformed it into a demonstration of careful strategy, patience, and responsibility. She felt a quiet sense of triumph, knowing that her planning and observation had produced the intended result. She also noticed subtle reactions from the neighbors. Some gave her approving nods. Others whispered compliments about her cleverness and composure. She felt a connection with the community, understanding that her actions had not only protected her dignity, but it also demonstrated courage and intelligence to those around her. The moment was not about conflict alone. It was about showing that careful planning, observation, and responsibility could stand up to arbitrary authority without causing harm or chaos. By late morning, the HOA members began to withdraw, moving away from the snow piles and back toward their vehicles. They were still muttering among themselves, their confidence shaken but their authority intact in a formal sense. She knew that the impact of her actions would last longer than their presence. The image of the carefully arranged snow and her composed stance would linger in their minds. They had intended to humiliate her, but instead, they were confronted with intelligence, planning, and composure. She remained outside, making small adjustments to the snow piles, ensuring they stayed safe and visible, but also maintaining her calm presence. She watched as the last of the HOA members left, their expressions mixed with frustration, respect, and acknowledgement of her cleverness. The neighborhood, now observing quietly, seemed to shift subtly in mood. The balance of power had not been destroyed, but it had been challenged in a way that was safe, intelligent, and undeniably effective. As the afternoon sun began to dip toward the horizon, she stepped back from the street, feeling a sense of completion. The plan had been executed precisely as intended. The snow had served as a natural tool, a canvas for demonstrating her intelligence and careful planning. The HOA had been confronted not with aggression, but with strategy, observation, and responsibility. She felt a deep sense of empowerment, knowing that she had faced an unfair challenge and turned it into an opportunity to assert her dignity. Her neighbors began to return indoors, some lingering briefly to offer quiet smiles or nods of approval. She felt a connection to the community, understanding that her actions had communicated more than words ever could. She had stood up against arbitrary authority, protected her dignity, and demonstrated that intelligence, patience, and creativity could prevail even in challenging situations. The snow-covered street, once a symbol of inconvenience, had become a stage for quiet triumph. As evening approached, she returned to her home, warmed by the knowledge of what had been accomplished. She reviewed the events mentally, noting how observation, careful planning, deliberate action had created the outcome she desired. She felt pride not in confrontation, but in the thoughtful, intelligent way she had navigated a difficult situation. The HOA had tried to humiliate her, but she had responded with strategy, patience, and creativity. That night, she sat by the window, looking out over the snow-covered street. The quiet of the neighborhood, the soft glow of the streetlights reflecting off the snow, and the sense of accomplishment filled her with calm satisfaction. She knew that her actions had made a statement not just to the HOA, but to herself and her neighbors. She had shown that standing up for oneself did not require aggression or recklessness, but careful thought, intelligence. In courage, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point, the initial frustration, the careful observation, the planning, and the execution. Each step had been deliberate, guided by patience, intelligence, and a desire to act responsibly. She realized that this experience had not only protected her dignity, but it also strengthened her sense of self, her confidence, and her ability to navigate challenges thoughtfully. As she prepared for the next day, she felt a sense of readiness and calm. The snow outside, now slightly melting under the late evening sun, had fulfilled its role as a tool and a statement. She had faced the HOA's attempt to humiliate her with intelligence, strategy, and composure, and she had emerged empowered and respected. The moment was a testament to careful planning, observation, and the quiet strength that comes from acting with intelligence and integrity. The morning after the confrontation arrived with a soft winter light, casting long shadows across the snow-covered street. She stepped outside, breathing in the crisp air and feeling a quiet sense of satisfaction. The snow, which had been central to her carefully planned statement, had begun to melt slightly, but the impression it had made remained fresh in her mind. The HOA's attempts to humiliate her had not only failed, they had backfired in the most satisfying way possible. She felt a deep sense of accomplishment and relief. Neighbors were stirring, some stepping out to check on their own properties, others pausing to look at the street. Whispers traveled quietly through the block, small conversations about what had happened yesterday. The cleverness of the homeowner who had stood up to the HOA and the visible, strategic snow piles that had temporarily blocked the street. She noticed small smiles and approving nods from those who passed by. It was a quiet acknowledgement of her intelligence and courage. In her mind, she realized that this moment was bigger than just herself. It was about standing up against unfair authority in a way that inspired others. She walked slowly down her driveway. Noting the way the snow had settled overnight, it was still clear, safe, and purposeful. She reflected on the past few weeks, the letters, the inspections, the constant scrutiny, and the emotional toll. It had been exhausting, frustrating, and sometimes humiliating. But it had also been a lesson in patience, strategy, and self-respect. She had learned to observe carefully, to plan meticulously, and to act with courage when the moment was right.